You checked your portfolio this morning. Maybe it was fine, maybe it was down a little. Either way, you closed the app and got on with your day because markets go up and down and everyone knows that's just how it works. Here's what nobody told you. Every financial crash in recorded history, the tulips, the railroads, the dot-coms, 2008, every single one of them followed the same 5 stages, in the same order, with the same psychology driving each one. And the truly unsettling part isn't that crashes keep happening, it's that every single time the people living through it were absolutely convinced that this time was different, that the rules had changed, that they were the generation smart enough to have finally figured it out. They weren't, and neither probably are we. Let's start with the spark. Every crash begins not with greed, but with something completely legitimate, a real discovery, a genuine shift in the world. The Dutch weren't idiots when tulip mania started in the 1630s. Tulips were genuinely exotic, genuinely rare, and genuinely new to Europe. The dot-com boom started because the internet was, in fact, going to change everything. It did. The 2008 housing bubble started because, for most of the 20th century, house prices in America had never fallen nationally. That wasn't a myth. It was true. This is the part that makes crashes so hard to see coming. Stage 1 isn't irrational. Stage 1 makes complete sense. Economists call it the displacement, a term borrowed from the late economist Hyman Minsky, whose work on financial instability was largely ignored during his lifetime and almost universally cited after every major crash since. Minsky argued that stability itself is destabilizing, that long periods of calm teach people to take risks they wouldn't otherwise take, borrow money they wouldn't otherwise borrow, and trust systems they've never actually tested. The seed of every crash is planted during the boom that came before it. Something real changes. People notice. Money starts to move toward it. And that's when the story stops being about the thing and starts being about the money. This is where it gets interesting. Stage 2 is the boom. And the boom feels fantastic. This is the part everyone remembers. The parties, the magazine covers, the taxi drivers giving stock tips. But beneath the surface, something specific is happening that most people miss entirely. New buyers are entering the market, not sophisticated investors, not people who understood the original displacement, people who heard their neighbor made money, people who don't want to be left behind. In behavioral economics, this is called herding, the deeply human instinct to assume that if everyone around you is doing something, it probably makes sense. We are a social species. Following the crowd kept our ancestors alive. It just doesn't work especially well in financial markets. In 2003, economists Marcus Brunemeyer at Princeton and Stefan Nagel at Stanford published a paper in the Journal of Finance examining what sophisticated hedge funds actually did during the dot-com bubble. The finding was uncomfortable. They didn't short the bubble. They didn't step back. They rode it, deliberately. They knew prices were detached from reality and they bought anyway, betting they could get out before it collapsed. Some did, many didn't. Even the people who knew it was a bubble couldn't stop themselves from being inside it. That's not stupidity. That's the trap of stage 2. The music is playing, everyone is dancing, and the rational move for any individual is to keep dancing and just try to be close to the door. The problem is everyone thinks they're close to the door. Now stage 3 is euphoria, and euphoria is where normal people, careful people, sensible people, people who clip coupons and comparison shop for car insurance, start doing things they would never ordinarily do. This is the stage where a new theory emerges, not just optimism, a fully formed intellectual argument for why the old rules no longer apply. In 1929, it was the permanent plateau theory, the idea, argued seriously by respected economists, that the stock market had reached a new stable high from which it would never significantly fall. In 2006, it was the efficient market hypothesis dressed up as common sense. Housing prices had never fallen nationally, therefore they couldn't. In 1999, it was price-to-earnings ratios don't matter anymore because we're measuring the wrong thing. Every bubble gets its own philosophy, a bespoke set of reasons why this time is genuinely different. And here is the uncomfortable fact. Presented as gently as possible, the people making these arguments were not fools. Many of them were brilliant. Irving Fisher was one of the most respected economists in American history. In October 1929, he declared that stocks had reached what looked like a permanently high plateau. Days later, the market began the collapse that would eventually wipe out nearly 90% of its value. Fisher himself lost the equivalent of over $100 million in today's money. He spent the rest of his life trying to pay off the debt. Intelligence doesn't protect you from euphoria. It just gives you better tools to justify it. There's also something else happening in stage 3 that rarely gets discussed. Credit, borrowing, the quiet expansion of debt that lets the party run longer than it should. When prices are rising, borrowing to invest feels not just reasonable, but obvious. You put in $1, it becomes $2, so why wouldn't you borrow 10? Margin lending in the 1920s, interest-only mortgages in the 2000s. The specific instrument changes. The logic is always identical. The higher it goes, the more certain everyone becomes that it will keep going. And then someone, somewhere, quietly leaves the room. Stage 4 is the one that happens before most people realize anything has changed. Economists call it financial distress. It doesn't announce itself. There's no bell, no headline that says the crash has started. What happens is quieter and stranger than that. The smart money, the institutional investors, the hedge funds, the people closest to the actual mechanics of whatever the boom was built on, starts to get uncomfortable, not panicked, uncomfortable. They begin selling, slowly at first, taking profits, reducing exposure. The market wobbles but doesn't fall because there are still enough new buyers coming in to absorb the selling. For a while, it looks like a healthy correction. This is the cruelest phase because the wobble brings in a fresh wave of buyers who've been waiting on the sidelines, people who thought they'd missed it and are relieved to finally get in at a slight discount. In the literature, this is sometimes called the sucker rally, a term that sounds harsh until you understand that it's not about the intelligence of the people involved. It's about information asymmetry. The people selling know something the people buying don't. Not necessarily about fraud, just about the gap between what something is worth and what it's currently selling for. That gap has been widening for months or years, and now it's starting to matter. Somewhere in this stage, credit starts to tighten. A lender gets nervous. A margin call goes out. Someone who borrowed to invest has to sell something to cover it. That selling puts pressure on prices, which triggers another margin call, which triggers more selling. It's not a crash yet. It's a mechanism slowly engaging, like watching a long row of dominoes beginning to tip, one by one, so slowly at first that you can't quite tell if it's really happening. It is really happening. Now the next part feels like falling. Stage 5 is panic. And panic is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. It is a specific neurological state in which the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for long-term thinking, for rationality, for remembering that markets have always eventually recovered, effectively goes offline. What's left is the limbic system, ancient, fast, designed not for financial markets but for predators, and the limbic system has one instruction: get out. This is why crashes fall so much faster than bubbles rise. A boom that took 7 years to build can be unwound in 7 weeks. Not because the underlying assets suddenly became worthless overnight, but because fear, unlike greed, is contagious in a way that has no natural ceiling. Greed is tempered by caution, by doubt, by the voice that says maybe I should wait. Fear has no equivalent brake. When everyone is selling, the rational move is to sell too, and everyone knows everyone else knows this, so the selling accelerates in a loop that feels, from the inside, completely unstoppable. What's striking, looking across history, is how consistent the bottom looks, not in numbers, in behavior. The moment of maximum pessimism, the front pages declaring the end of capitalism, the experts explaining why recovery is impossible, almost always arrives just before or just after the actual floor. The crash ends not when the problems are solved, but when the last seller has sold, when there is nobody left who wants out. The silence after panic is where markets find their ground. The 5 stages don't end with answers, they end with exhaustion. And then, quietly, a displacement happens somewhere. Something real changes, something new, and the whole thing begins again. Look at your phone again. Whatever number is sitting in your portfolio right now, up, down, flat. It was produced by millions of people making decisions shaped by the same 5 stages that drove Dutch merchants to pay a year's salary for a single flower bulb. The crash doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from optimism, from a real thing that became a story about a real thing, and then a story about the story, until the original thing was almost beside the point. Every generation walks into stage 1 believing they're too smart for stage 5. They have more data, better models, more sophisticated tools. They're probably right about all of that. It doesn't seem to help. You closed the app this morning and got on with your day. That was probably the right call, just maybe not for the reasons you thought.